So the objective that I have for you all today is to increase your understanding and application of the science of learning, but I'm going to give you a broad overview. So there'll be things in here that you could probably read an entire book on, right? But I want to give you a broad perspective of some of the things that are involved in learning from more of a scientific perspective. And so an overview, we'll start with some fun facts. We'll go into learning. We'll talk a little bit more about the brain. If you were here last time, you should know a little bit about that. And then we'll talk about some of the factors affecting learning. We'll go in a little bit of what teaching is all about, and then we'll hit our conclusion, okay? So starting with the fun facts, remember that humans start learning in the womb, right? So babies come out and they kind of already know how to smell. Like they can smell their mother's breast milk. They can hear things in the womb. And so humans start learning in the womb. And so babies are born into this unknown world, and you basically have to learn everything, right? Culture, language, technology. But our brains have a limited ability to be able to multitask. So you can't really, do two tasks at the same time very easily. You can kind of switch between those tasks very quickly, but you can't really do one task as well as if you were just focusing, all of your attention on it. However, you can automate, right? So it's this idea of muscle memory. So imagine the first time that you drove a vehicle versus now. You're probably able to switch your attention to other things other than, the steering wheel and how to switch gears and whatnot. So your brain is very good at automating as well. Think about when you walk, right? Also, learning is spread out over time, right? And so it's good to not overload your brain at any one given time. So it's this idea of a cognitive load that we have. And so if there's just too much information, it's very hard for us to retain it. And so repetition is also key. Multimedia tools and technology have really enhanced our ability to be able to learn. And so think about your files on your computer as kind of an extension of your brain. Like all of my files of all of my schoolwork and whatnot are organized in a way where I know where it is. I might not be able to recall it with my brain, but I know where it is on my computer. Your brain prefers images over text on average. So you've probably heard of pictures are worth 1,000 words. Your brain prefers certain times of the day. So remember your circadian rhythm that we talked about last time. And then game is really important. So think about the gamification of learning and, why games are engaging and why a lot of learning has, started to really embrace the idea of gaming. And then also remember that your brain is physically different after learning. So you have new neural connections that are made. All right, so let's get into the idea of learning. And so remember that your brain is multifunctional. From a neuroscience perspective, we can look at, what areas of the brain are involved in learning. But remember that we have, these different areas that are responsible for different things. And so the general functions are understood, but the complex behaviors and disorders are not really well understood. We're going to kind of focus in again on this triune theory of the human brain. And so it's this idea that when you think about your brain, you can think about your reptile brain, which was basically your most ancient, brainstem, innermost part of the brain for survival and regulation and autonomic processes. Then you have your mammalian brain, your limbic system, midbrain, right? And that's emotions and fear and episodic memory and whatnot. And then you have your human brain, what makes you human, your cortex, your neo-mammalian brain, your forebrain. That's the most highly evolved outer part of the brain. It's not even fully developed until you're about 25, right? And that's where we get rational thinking and, learning. A lot of semantic memory and self-control comes from there as well. So you might think about why young kids are not as in control of their behavior as a mature adult. And so getting into this, the limbic system, right? So limbic comes from this idea of the border or edge between this diencephalon and the cerebral cortex. And so the reason why the limbic system is kind of important for us is because it's involved with emotions and memory. And clearly when we're learning, we have emotions and we have and memory at play, right? As well as reinforcing behavior. And so we can look at the different parts of the of the limbic system, and we'll see some of these parts a little bit later, but that's an important part that we will want to know about. And so to try to describe this a little bit further, we have a neuroscientist here that will kind of describe these three parts of the brain, and what's the best way of thinking about the brain.
What's the best way to think about the brain? It's insanely complicated. Everything connects to everything, a gazillion little subregions. Amid all that complexity, there's a broadly sort of simplifying way to sort of think about aspects of brain function when it comes to behavior. And this was an idea put forth by this guy, Paul MacLean, a grand poobah on the field, conceptually of thinking in the brain as coming in three functional layers, the triune brain. And again, this is highly schematic. The brain really doesn't come in three layers, but one can think of the firstmost, the bottommost, the most ancient as being what's often termed the reptilian brain, where basically the parts in there, we've got the same wiring as in a lizard, as in any ancient creature. It's been there forever, ancient wiring at the base of the brain, most inside. And what does that region do? All the regulatory stuff. Your body temperature changes, it senses it and causes you to sweat or shiver. It's monitoring your blood glucose levels. It's like releasing hormones that are essential to sort of everyday shopkeeping. It's just, keeping regulatory stuff in balance. Sitting on top of that is conceptually what could be termed the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain. And this is very much a mammalian specialty. Lizards are not well known for their emotional lives. Part of the brain having to do with fear, arousal, anxiety, sexual longings, all those sorts of things, very mammalian. You're off there in the grasslands, butting heads with somebody else with antlers, and it's your limbic system that's heavily involved in that. Then sitting on the top is the layer 3, the cortex. The cortex, spanking new, most recently evolved part of the brain. Everybody's got a little bit of cortex, but it's not till you get to primates that you got tons, and then apes, and then us. So functionally, it's very easy to think of this simplistic flow of commands. Layer 2, the limbic system, could make layer 1, the reptilian brain, activate. When is that? Your heart speeds faster, not because of a regulatory reptilian thing, ooh, you've been cut, something painful, but an emotional state. You're a wildebeest and there's some scary, menacing wildebeest threatening you in your and that emotional state causes your limbic system to activate the reptilian brain, and your heart beats faster. You have a stress response, not because a regulatory change happened in your body, but for an emotional reason. Then it's very easy to think of layered on top, this cortical area commanding your second layer, your limbic system, to have an emotional response. Rather than something emotional, here's a threatening beast right in front of you, something emotional, you see a movie that's emotionally upsetting. See a movie. These are not real characters, they're pixels, and it's your cortex that's turning that abstract cognitive state into an emotional response. Likewise, your cortex, layer 3, could influence events down in layer 1. You see something upsetting, you think about something, you think about mortality. One of these days my heart is going to stop beating, and your heart's going to beat faster. You're not bleeding and hypotensive, you're not in some hypoglycemia. Nothing in the reptilian brain could make sense of this. A purely cognitive state, ooh, on the other side of the planet there are people undergoing some traumatic event, and I feel upset about it, and your reptilian brain responds. So it's very easy, given that, to think of a 3 talks to 2 talks to 1 sort of scenario. Just as readily, though, 1 talks to 2 talks to 3. What would be a case of that? What's your reptilian brain talking to your cortex? Remarkable finding. When we're hungry, we make harsher moral judgments about people's transgressions. We're less charitable. We cheat more in economic games. Our cortex assessing the effects of pro-sociality, anti-sociality, and altruism and its evolution, and part of what it's doing in deciding how it feels about somebody else's plight is if your stomach's gurgling, if you're hungry, if you're in pain, that affects very cortical judgment type areas. Layer 1, this ancient reptilian brain that should have nothing to do with how your cortex works, having tons to do with it. Or layer 2 influencing layer 3, your limbic system, your emotional state influence your abstract cognitive processes. What's the most obvious example of it? When we're under stress, when we're in an emotionally aroused state, we make stupid, impulsive decisions that seem brilliant at the time. Affective, emotional, limbic layer 2 influencing how your cortical cortex goes about its abstractions. It's not that abstract. It's embedded in the biology of all these layers. This interaction between these layers, seems this very mechanical process, potentially even an unconscious one. How do we consciously have, say, our cortex regulate an emotion, a limbic 2 layer? Simple. Think about the most arousing, wonderful thing that ever happened to you umpteen decades ago, and your cortex is evoking a memory that's got your limbic system humming along in some excited state. Or think cortically, or pull out the memories of some traumatic event, and your limbic system is responding. How about reptilian level? Easy to make it get into an agitated state. Sit there and think about something incredibly upsetting. Think about some memory that was truly disturbing. Think about mortality. Think about global warming. And your heart speeds up. Layer 3, in a very conscious way, has mobilized layer 1. A lot harder is the inverse. You're sitting there and you suffer from high blood pressure, and either they could marinate you in antihypertensive drugs for the rest of your life, or an alternative approach, a biofeedback approach, is sit there and think about the happiest day of your life. Think about being in an open field that's beautiful. Think about your favorite vacation. Think about, and if it's the right thinking about, suddenly your heart slows down. Suddenly your blood pressure goes down. The core of biofeedback is figuring out what sort of conscious states you can evoke that will affect your reptilian brain in a direction that's good for your health. And all you do then is learn how to get better and better in some stressed, hypertensive circumstance. What conscious, active thinking can I mobilize here at this point that will cause changes in how my big toe's blood flow is working? In a case like that, that is very conscious regulation of more autonomic, more ancient parts of your brain.
All right. So hopefully you found that interesting. I think that basically underlying, underpinning all of learning is the idea of, your brain and memory and thinking, right? So the brain is really the center of where learning happens. And so if we don't understand the brain, how can we really understand learning and teaching, right? And so the idea of memory, right, is that your brain never really forgets anything. And so forgetting is just the inability to recall stored information or failure to store information in the first place. And then we have this idea of short-term memory and long-term memory, which we'll get into a little bit later. But a lot of it is happening in the temporal lobe. And so when we look at this temporal lobe for hearing, language, memory, we can see that there's more neural activity in this region after learning, right? And so we definitely have evidence of the functions of the different parts of the brain here, right? So now let's get into the multimodal store of memory, this multi-store model of memory. So the idea is we have information coming through our senses, our perception, right? And that's basically, you can touch things, taste things, smell things, hear things, see things, right? This data comes into our brain, okay? That's basically the first step. And then, so we have this environmental stimuli, and that's coming in through, into our sensory memory. And then a lot of that is just lost, right? In about less than a second, you really are pretty bad at taking in all of this data and remembering everything, right? And it's not a horrible thing, because if we did, our brain would become cluttered with all of this data that we're getting all the time. And so really what we need is attention. And so we start to pay attention to different things. And that's why a lot of people can be, present at the same event, but they can remember different things about the same exact event because people are paying attention to different things. And so then that's where that short-term memory comes in, right? So you have about a 7-item capacity. Interestingly enough, if you think about your phone number, that is 7 digits. And so we have this ability, though, to maintain or rehearse this. And this is often called the working memory as well, but we can call it also the short-term memory. And that's less than a minute usually, but it can be refreshed. And so imagine thinking about something or being in a, intense conversation for like an hour. All right. But the important thing to note, though, is that we can retrieve information from long-term memory, but we can also encode or transfer, store into long-term memory. And so this is really where that learning takes place. And so you can think about your working memory kind of as your consciousness. And so we can pull information into our consciousness, but then we can also encode information out of our consciousness. And so now we have our long-term memory, which we can really potentially last a lifetime. And we have different ways that we can look at long-term memory. We have explicit or implicit. So basically your conscious or unconscious things that we have in our long-term memory. So we have our experienced events. And we have, semantic knowledge and, basically knowledge and concepts. That's the more obvious stuff. But we also have implicit memories as well. And so we have like procedural stuff like skills and actions, but also emotional conditioning and priming. So if you see, a dead animal in the street and you get really sad about that, that might have been due to some emotional conditioning. All right. And then we can basically, have this information retrieval from our working memory, as we're working with it. So this is a nice little model of how memory works. All right, but it really kind of boils down a lot of it to attention. So that's a key aspect of learning as well, is kind of leveraging your own attention, but also if you're teaching, leveraging other people's attention. All right. So more specifically with memory, we have the neocortex, which is largely responsible for your consciousness and your, sensory memory. And you basically have this situation where your hippocampus can transfer memories here as general knowledge, but it's the largest part of the cerebral cortex. Okay, and so you have a nice little picture here. So all of these are involved in memory. We also have our prefrontal cortex. So that's, part of the neocortex. And that's a lot of times where we think that short-term and working memory happens, but it's involved in remembering semantic tasks, so knowledge and concepts that you might have. Then we have our hippocampus, which is associated with our experienced events, our episodic memory, recognition and encoding of information into long-term memory. So the hippocampus is often referred to as one of the most important aspects of learning when we're talking about the brain. The amygdala is also very important because it modifies the strength and the emotional content of our memories, and we also have fear memories happening. So if we have an experience that it puts us in a extreme state of fear, the amygdala every time that we experience a similar situation is going to be highly active. And so, and those memories are often really strong and full of emotional content because of our amygdala. And then we also have our basal ganglia, and we have our cerebellum. And so that is more for procedural fine motor skills for the cerebellum, and then emotion recognition and the coordination of different sequences of motor activity with the basal ganglia. But those are some of the key players in our brain. And it's not as important that you memorize that what part of the brain does what specific thing. It's just I'm trying to make you aware of the stuff that we know and the different parts of the brain that are involved in learning. Okay, remember that the brain is one of the most complex, if not the most complex system in the universe. The other way to think about this is the idea of the unconscious, subconscious, and conscious mind. right? So the idea that, you know, neuron communication, right, is the root of all of our thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And we also have brain waves, which are basically synchronized pulses, you know, coming from these masses of neurons communicating with each other. And so if we start with the unconscious mind, we have basically the autonomic nervous system. It's kind of like our, you know, reptilian brain from that video. And so just different things like your heartbeat, breathing, just you don't really need to have any conscious awareness or control of it, right? We don't need to control our heartbeat. Okay, and that's basically using delta brain waves, so 0.5 to 3 hertz in frequency. And we also have our immune system here. Now, then we have our subconscious mind, and so it's kind of like the hard drive of your brain. So you have your behaviors and your habits here, right? But we also, you know, have feelings and emotions. We have our, you know, permanent memory here. We got, you know, alpha or theta brainwaves. So we're moving up in frequency here. We have 3 to 12 hertz, potentially unlimited space, right? And then we also have this idea of subliminal messages. So if you look at that picture there, have you ever seen this picture of the Tostitos? Did you ever notice, I know I haven't, that there is just kind of like this bowl of, you know, salsa or whatever, and these two people kind of enjoying it. There's little messages like this all over the place in advertising, marketing. It's basically ways that you can target somebody's subconscious mind. And so a significant amount of learning is actually subconscious. And so that's something that you should be aware of. Now, then we come to our conscious mind. So basically it's kind of like our working memory, and so we can only process like 5 to 7 bits of information at a time, but we do have our rational and, you know, reasoning, and we're thinking. We have some limited space though, and we have these you know, beta brain waves, which are 12 to 38 hertz. And if you look at the percentages here, roughly 30%, 60%, 10%. But this is really what makes us human, kind of, right? It's what makes us, you know, conscious. Okay. Now there is some evidence of the superconscious mind as well, and so this is the idea of increased perception. So like the idea of superhumans. There used to be a show, I think it might still exist, I believe it was called Superhumans, and they had all sorts of humans on there with extraordinary abilities, people able to hold their breath for a certain amount of time. You know, there was this person, I believe, who climbed Mount Everest, you know, in their boxers or something like that. You know, just people that are really able to, you know, be in touch with their physiology just at an extreme level. And so those could be considered gamma brain waves, or, you know, 38 to 42 hertz. And so that's another way of thinking about the mind. Now, we get into this idea of categorical thinking, which is one of the most important ideas in learning. And so it's this idea that humans use this categorical thinking to place boundaries and create categories. So it's this idea of a continuous versus a discrete situation. And so the categories, though, have disadvantages because you can't really see the holistic or big picture. So just some concrete examples here. If we look at light, okay, it's a spectrum. It's a continuous spectrum. But we humans have defined Roy G. Biv, basically, red, orange, yellow, right? But it's a continuous set of wavelengths of light. So we have 400 to 700 nanometers in wavelength defining those colors, but we just put that boundaries on it. We say, okay, magically at this point, we are going to put our boundaries there, right? Magically, when we define grades, A, B, C, D, F, right? We're going to place the boundary here. This is the difference between an A and a B. And so what's the difference between good and bad, right? We're going to put the boundary there. We're going to put a boundary between Democrat and Republican, right? And so we can put boundaries, you know, between, like I was saying, with the electromagnetic spectrum. And so it's all about the placing of these boundaries and the chunking of information that is extremely important in the idea of how your brain, you know, remembers things and how we learn things. And so it's this chunking of information because it's easier to encode it as a chunk, right? And so these neural chunks are well-practiced neural patterns that are created through repetition. And it's this idea, the way for us to connect these pathways together. And learning is basically then the process of building more and bigger chunks by storing and further connecting information into long-term memory. All right. And another way to think about this is think about all the textbooks, right? They're set up like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Don't you think that that's chunking, right? The different sections within the chapter. We also chunk the idea of energy, like this big concept, energy, or the human body is a chunk, or STEM, or F equals MA, right? Is it, I'll give you one quick example. Is it easier to remember the year 2019? Do you think, or is it easier to remember 2019 as separate things, right? So memory experts, people who have won the Guinness Book of World Records and things like that, what they do is they chunk numbers, for example, and they chunk them into they chunk the numbers into sometimes greater numbers, but then they associate a lot of times those chunks with a story. And then they'll tell a story with the chunks. And that's a way for them to remember a crazy amount of digits of pi, for example, like 3.14159, right? And they can go on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of digits. Okay, so that is how we can kind of leverage our brain and this idea of learning through chunking. So there's another thing to note that's really important is this dual process theory. So it's the idea that you have two neural modes and only one really can be active at a time. But learning involves going back and forth between the two. And so there's this dichotomy of thinking where we have this implicit or automatic stuff and this explicit and controlled stuff. And so we can split it into this unfocused mode or system 1. It's implicit cognitive ease. It's quick, right? It processes tons of information. It's full of shortcuts and heuristics. You have automatic responses. A quick example would be like if somebody asks you, how is your day? What are you going to say? Oh, it's going good, or whatever. You have some common response, right? It's a real quick response. It's made possible by long-term memory, and you have this whole library of experiences. And you have this idea of, diffused mode with you have, this thought that comes, and you have this, big picture thoughts. So you have diffuse thinking. And so it's broad and conceptual, strategic. It uncovers meaning and connection. So that's kind of one side of things. And then the other side of things is this focused mode, or explicit cognitive strain mode. It takes a little bit more memory, right? It's slow and it's lazy, right? But it basically allows you to work with this stuff. You have the working memory, limited capacity, and it allows you to focus and target different things. So you have this thought that's nice and concentrated, but it's necessary for deep work in order to happen. So that's another important idea of how the brain works. One idea that I came up with actually is the idea of different dimensions of your perspective on things. And so it kind of starts with that survival, that instinct, down with kind of like that layer 1 of the brain. But then you have this fundamental perspective that you start to develop when you are looking at things, and your understanding of the world is going up. The amount of energy that it's taking you to think about things is going up. The complexity is going up. We start to develop our personal lens on the world, and so we have this concrete, subjective reality, and we have sympathy. We have this sequential thought, but then we get into more of a social perspective where we're thinking a little bit more holistically. We have empathy for people instead of just sympathy. And then we get into the fourth dimension, kind of like the fourth dimension of space. It's not really accessible to us. It's not really fully accessible to us, but it's on the borderline of being objective. So stepping outside of humanity itself, basically, and looking at something without bias. So what does it mean to truly be objective rather than subjective? And then it's the idea of abstract rather than concrete. And so there's just these different dimensions increasing in complexity as we look at the world. The other thing to note is the idea of divergent and convergent thinking. And so it's the idea of, are you asking a question and kind of expanding out? Or are you doing the other, where you're kind of gathering facts and putting it into an answer? And so it's also the idea of deductive versus inductive reasoning. So are we going from a special case and, going up and using inductive reasoning to generalize into a general principle, or are we taking a general principle and deducting into a special case? And so that's done all the time with our thinking as well. Now, another thing to note is our beliefs. And so there's really two main types of beliefs. So you have like factual beliefs and ethical beliefs. And so it's this idea that basically facts are things that are known or proven to be true. It's what is, whereas values are, standards of behavior. So it's what ought to be. And so the idea is, you basically have this logical brain or emotional brain. And so an example would be water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen is a factual belief versus cruelty is wrong is an ethical belief. And these things are, discovered or constructed. A lot of times we prefer using the word constructed because we're kind of constructing these beliefs in our brain with neural pathways. But the words, discovered and constructed are often used to describe this. Now, if you think about it, beliefs are really the root of behavior, right, and result. And so you have this invisible part of this behavior iceberg. And so beliefs leading to values, thinking, emotions, and then you finally get to behaviors and results. And so we often don't think about what's under the surface. And so if you're familiar with an iceberg, there's a lot of stuff under the surface. And so we're very complicated creatures. We also have this, wheel of like feelings. And so if you've ever felt overwhelmed, that's a form of bad feeling, right? So you can kind of classify all of your feelings into bad, fearful, angry, disgusted, sad, happy, or surprised. And so clearly, these are at play as well and governed a lot of times by neurotransmitters. So we also get into the study of knowledge. So how do we understand knowledge a little bit better? That's basically epistemology. It's the study of knowledge, and it has many branches, but one of the more popular ones is constructivism in education. And that's the idea that humans construct knowledge and meaning from their experiences. And it's very similar to, how the brain forms memories by constructing new neural connections with neuroplasticity. We also have empiricism and rationalism and other things as well, but we're going to focus on constructivism. We also have this idea of the zone of proximal development. So you want things to be not too easy, but not too hard. We have to build upon our prior knowledge. We have scaffolding, which is kind of the support as this is being built. And then we have, different types of learning, situated inquiry, problem-based learning, and things like that, in which, we try to address this idea of, how people learn and the study of knowledge. So what is knowledge, right? So let's start with experience. Experience is practical contact with and observations of facts and events. So we have an experience. And then knowledge is acquired. So it's information and skills that are acquired by a person through experience. And so the brain, though, has plasticity. Remember, it can change. And so we absolutely can acquire new things, a new skill, but also think about synaptic pruning. If neural pathways are not used very often, there's a process called synaptic pruning, which takes place. It kind of prunes those connections, those synapses between neurons. And so then we can think about learning then as the acquisition of knowledge, right? Information and skills acquired. And learning then means that new nerve cells grew and made more connections through cognitive processes. And then again to this ZPD, this zone of proximal development, what we want to do then is keep the content in this zone of proximal development where it's not too easy and it's not too hard. If you've ever learned something that was really easy, you probably weren't very engaged. It wasn't very pleasurable. You already know it. But if you're in a class where, you maybe didn't take the prerequisite and things you don't even understand what they're saying because it's way too hard, obviously you're not going to have an enjoyable experience either. And so it's this idea that we want to stay in this zone of proximal development. Now, we also kind of need to go over some of these other words like cognition. It refers to mental processes involving learning, and cognitive processes would include, sensation, perception, attention, thinking, imagination, memory, and so on. So that's all about knowledge. So what is intelligence? Intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge. Okay, so we have this knowledge. What is our ability to acquire and apply this knowledge? And so that kind of points to two different kinds of intelligence then. So we have this idea of crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. And so this fluid intelligence is basically associated with your ability to acquire knowledge and think logically, identify patterns, and that actually, as you get older, is going to end up decreasing. But your crystalline intelligence is going to continue to increase throughout your life as you gain new experiences and new memories. And so that's really more of your ability to apply your knowledge once you have it, not necessarily acquire it, but apply it. And that's also kind of the difference between learning and wisdom. So you've heard of, the old wise person, right? There's a lot of truth to that. All right. So they have a lot of experiences that they can draw on. But we've probably also heard you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And there's some truth to that as well. And that kind of is associated with the idea of this fluid intelligence decreasing with age. Okay. But we also have our IQ. And so it's this idea that we have a mental age, and it can be measured in different ways. And that is, up for debate whether or not, that is accurate, right? So there's different tests that we can do to get what your mental age is. But the idea of an intelligence quotient, or your IQ, is just taking your mental age and dividing it by your chronological age. So if I have a mental age of 28 and my chronological age is 28 because I'm 28 years old, then that is 28 divided by 28, which is 1 times 100. So that's 100. That means I have an IQ of 100. So if your mental age matches up with your chronological age, your IQ is 100. Anything above 100 is basically, you're performing above your chronological age. Anything below 100, you're performing lower than your chronological age. And so the question is, how do we measure mental age, right? Now, this kind of goes into the idea of ignorance versus stupidity, right? So ignorance is lack of knowledge. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Everybody is ignorant on a big scale. If we consider that there's a lot of things that nobody knows, right? And so you'll never know everything. Okay, so you could literally spend the rest of your life trying to watch every YouTube video, and you probably would never be able to, because there's YouTube videos being posted faster than you could watch them. You could never read every book that was ever written, again, because there's books being written faster than you could read all of them. And you'll never meet every person on earth, because there's people dying and being born every second. So unless you could stop time and go around and meet every single person before somebody new was born or somebody died, it's just impossible. So we have to all accept the idea that we are all ignorant. We have a huge lack of knowledge. Stupidity is something different. Stupidity is lack of intelligence. So stupidity just basically, referring back to the idea of your ability to acquire and apply knowledge is low if we're referring to stupidity. We can look at this graph here. The majority of what there is to know in the world are things that you don't even know that you don't know, right? And then there's the things that you know, right? It's not a lot. And then there's the stuff that you know you don't know. Okay, so you're familiar with it, but you don't know the details of it. And then there's the stuff that you think you know, right? And then remember, the majority is the stuff that you don't even know that you don't know about. And that kind of goes along with the idea of the more you know about what you don't know. Basically, it's like this never-ending thing. The other thing is this confidence, all right? It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's the idea that as we become competent with something, we have a huge spike in confidence. Okay, so imagine you start learning about something that you didn't know of before. Let's say you jump into politics and you're like, hey, I got it mastered. I know everything there is about what it means to be, pro-life or whatever. And then all of a sudden you start learning more and you become more and more competent. And then you're like, uh-oh, I actually don't know anything. And your confidence level drops way down, and then it slowly starts to come back up. And so if you meet somebody that's extremely confident about their competence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a lot of competence. Okay, it could be because of this effect. Now, other thing to note about intelligence is artificial intelligence. So one of the reasons why we're really talking about this is because artificial intelligence is right at the cutting edge of what we're doing in society. And so we have, computer systems that perform tasks that would usually require human intelligence, but we're doing it with artificial intelligence. We also have machine learning and deep learning as well. Okay, we have virtual reality, we have augmented reality. We also have what was just announced not too long ago by Elon Musk. We have this idea of a neural link. All right, are we able to make a connection into our brain and be able to potentially at some point in the future access the internet through our brain with this, brain, internet interface? We also have the idea of neural networks, which are basically just algorithms to recognize patterns. And so linear algebra is really an important aspect of this. But it's the idea that where you basically just have this kind of function, right? You have the inputs and outputs, and we're trying to recognize patterns. Humans are pattern recognition machines, and a lot of stuff that's going on right now with technology and artificial intelligence that's going to be affecting our lives, self-driving cars and whatnot, stems to this idea of human learning and artificial intelligence. Okay, so now we have the idea of schemas. Now, schemas are mental frameworks, right? And it's this idea from Piaget, and he's one of the very well-known names in education and how people learn and develop. And so he says that, hey, there's this idea of assimilation and accommodation, okay? And we also have equilibration to eliminating compatibility. So let's kind of go through an example quick. So you have a child, let's say, that's looking at a picture of a cow. And so the child is developing this new schema for what a cow is from this picture book, right? Now, the child then sees a moose and then tries calling it a cow. Hey, that's a cow. I just saw that in my picture book. But it's not, right? And so they're trying to assimilate this moose into the mental framework that they've developed, but it's not true. And so what they must do then is accommodate and create a new schema. So they have to accommodate this schema, and they have to include moose, baby moose, etc. And so it's this idea that we have this mental framework, we have these schemas out there for what stuff is, like what is a ball. And that schema needs to be modified over time and kind of honed in as we learn new things. So as you take in new information, you're either assimilating it into an existing schema, or you have to kind of accommodate and maybe create a new schema. All right. It's very similar to the idea of conceptions. So I kind of view schemas and conceptions very similarly. So whenever we have a phenomenon, it's basically something that is observed to exist, to happen. And so especially something where you don't really know what the explanation is. And so that's a really important root of a lot of where these conceptions can take place. And so the idea of a conception is just forming of ideas or a person's knowledge structure, so that mental framework associated with a particular event. And a lot of times what we have is alternative conceptions, or sometimes we call them misconceptions as to how things happen. So for example, if you think that water will get smaller when it freezes, you could say that, because we know that usually when things get colder, they get smaller, they contract. But you'd be wrong, because we know that water actually expands as it freezes, which is why we kind of have, potholes and all sorts of things. And so that would be an idea of we need to kind of convert our alternative conception to more scientific conceptions, so scientifically acceptable conceptions, very similar to the idea of schemas. And so in order for this to happen, we really need to look at how our brain is getting pleasure. All right, so we have reward systems in our brain, which you're probably familiar with, dopamines, endorphins, etc., necessary for survival. And nobody wants to be bored, right? Boredom is a state of stress. And so if you think about it, there was an experiment done, it's a white room experiment, where you basically just put into this white room with, very little stimuli, and you just kind of drive yourself insane. Your brain is in a state of boredom. Your brain is kind of trained to look for changes and to learn and to be engaged. And if you don't have that, it's going to be difficult for you. There was an experiment done, it's where they put somebody in a room, and the main thing that they were allowed to engage with is this instrument where they got electrocuted. And so over time, people got so bored just from sitting there waiting that they would actually electrocute themselves. So you're actually inflicting pain to yourself because you're so bored. You would rather electrocute yourself than be bored. Think about your phones and the social media and the internet and how they leverage this boredom. They don't want you to be bored. They want you to scroll forever, right? You look on Facebook, you look on YouTube, you just keep scrolling and scrolling. It'll never end because it wants to continue to, expose you to new information. And so it's this idea where, the stuff that's too hard or too easy is not pleasurable. It goes back to that zone of proximal development. And so we want to stay in that area that's just right, which is why a lot of times we have targeted advertisements too. All right, so our data is sent out to all these different companies, and we know that we get, if we just looked on Amazon for a particular item, we're going to see that everywhere now, right? So it's this idea of targeting based on familiarity, and so we get some pleasure from that, and we know that a lot of people in marketing are really familiar with that. So what do learners find difficult, right? So difficult things involve higher order thinking. It involves abstract ideas. You cannot see them or experience them directly. And really your brain is not even fully capable of that abstract thought until we have that fully developed brain. So you can imagine that you can't really teach calculus, for example, maybe to like a 3-year-old, okay? But the idea that your brain learns through similes and analogies by making these complex network of connections. So the idea of energy is a very abstract idea, but we can link it to all sorts of different things. And so that's one good way of viewing how your brain learns. All right, and so just remember that boredom is a state of stress. We kind of want to avoid it at all costs, but we do find it difficult to learn in a boring environment as well. So now let's go on to factors affecting learning, right? And we'll briefly cover this. So development is one thing that definitely will affect your learning. Remember, you can't really teach calculus to a 3-year-old, and so we have Piaget and Erikson, which they came out with some ideas for development. And we'll talk more on human development with one of the next in the series. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this now, but it's the idea that basically you're developing throughout time, and so that will absolutely impact your learning, right? And so the other thing is identity, right? So it's this idea of group identity versus individual identity. Remember the categorical thinking and the danger of labeling somebody. So for example, race or gender, part of your internal dimensions of identity. If you categorize somebody based on that group identity, it's a danger to do that because it's an oversimplification, but it makes sense why we do that often in society and on the news, because remember, it's easier to do that. It's easier to chunk people and say, oh, you're a woman, or oh, you're white, or oh, you're rich, or oh, you are a director of something. Like all directors are equal, right? Like all people who have high income are equal, right? It doesn't make any sense. The idea is that the sum of your group identities approaches your individual identities. So when you look at all the different group identities that you belong to, it basically is forming your individual identity, which should be paramount. It's often not, but it should be. Remember, we're all human. We all belong to the human identity, but we all are unique. And so it's important to remember that. The other thing is attitude, mindset, and outlook. So a lot of work was done by Carol Dweck on this idea of a growth mindset and this idea of grit as well with Duckworth. And basically it's this idea that intelligence is not the whole story, right? Grit, they found, is a great predictor of success, not just intelligence. And what is grit? It's passion and perseverance for long-term goals. What they did is they went to a bunch of classrooms, a bunch of companies, and they said, who is successful here? Who? And what they found is the most successful people are not necessarily the most intelligent, and they looked at a lot of different things, but it comes back to this idea of grit, all right? It's the idea that failure is not a permanent condition. Failure is an opportunity to grow. If you have a growth mindset, you're associating with things like this. If you have a fixed mindset, you're basically viewing failure as the limit of your abilities. Very bad trap to get yourself into. So growth mindset versus fixed mindset, a big deal when it comes to learning, a huge factor that can affect learning. And it's this idea that the growth mindset will drive and motivate, drives motivation and achievement. So another thing then is, what is motivation, engagement, and attention, right? So that motivation, engagement, and attention, very similar. That's an important aspect of learning. So I would point to this expectancy value theory of motivation, and I kind of modified it a little bit. These are pictures of me engaging students in my classroom, and you got to think about this because it's important that you're engaged in learning. And how can we do that? Well, two main things that kind of come up is relevance. How can you get things to be relevant to people? You have a context or medium for learning. You really, in order to do that, you need to have relationships. with people because you need to know about their prior knowledge and what they're doing and how to relate it to their life, right? And you also need to have interdisciplinary connections too, make it relevant to a different field. And then there's also the idea of story, right? Humans are storytellers. Throughout history, generations have passed on stories, right? And so it's this idea of what do we value, traditions, benefit, culture, emotion, mystery. Basically, we're being pulled in for what it is now, not for what it promises later, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be relevant. So relevance and story are two key aspects of engagement and motivation. And we also have this idea of, hey, we could have this multiple intelligence. It's the idea by Howard Gardner. And so it's the idea that maybe you're intelligent in one area of your life, but not another area of your life. So maybe you're an Olympic athlete, so your body's smart, but you're not logically smart. However, this has been largely kind of disproven over the years. But we do have strengths, right? We do have things that we might be strong at. But this idea of talent, your natural intelligence to something it pales in comparison. So the quality of your performance really is a sum of your knowledge, practice, and talent. And talent is really a very small part. Really, it depends on practice and then really your knowledge, which is information and skills acquired. So if you think about Michael Phelps, for example, who's one of the most well-known decorated Olympians of all time. He's an Olympic swimmer, right? But if you were to, challenge him to a game that you were good at, that he doesn't know, right? So maybe it's Catan or Monopoly or whatever, and you're really good at it, you probably could beat Michael Phelps. So he's very, very good in one aspect of his life, but it doesn't mean he's unbeatable in all aspects. And so it's this idea that we can be, very knowledgeable and very intelligent in one area of our life and not another. Okay, but that a lot of times comes through practice. Another really important thing that affects learning is adverse childhood experiences. And so this is from the CDC, some of this information, and it's basically boils down to abuse, neglect, and household challenges. And so it's very important because this can actually lead to an early death. And so it's this idea where have you experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect? Did you have an incarcerated household member, mental illness in the household, and so on? And so that really affects people's learning. Now, it has lasting impacts as well. So it's known that high levels of cortisol, which is the stress-induced hormone, can wear down on your brain's ability to function properly, right? And it also can lead to all sorts of different things: injury, mental health, infectious diseases, opportunities with education, right? So it's a very big thing to consider. And the other big takeaway message from this is that there's always a reason for behavior, right? Always. And it stems from nature and nurture. So if you're willing to understand and dig down into the root of somebody's behavior, it'll really go a long way in understanding where that person's coming from. All right. Now, if you are in this boat and you need some sort of emotional toolkit, Dr. McNally came out with this emotional toolkit, which is a great idea. So these are some of the things that you can do, and it's proven to help relieve stress if you do one of these things for at least 10 minutes. So read, garden, go for a walk, exercise, call a friend. It's this idea that, if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. And if you're at peace, you're living in the present. And so that's an important quote to kind of understand. Some people have severe anxiety or depressive, depression issues. Now, another thing to consider is people's personality. Obviously, that's going to affect learning. We're all unique. And so one of the big 5 characteristics associated with personality have been evaluated throughout the years. It was kind of boiled down to the big 5, right? So we have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so we can kind of see what would happen if you had a low score with those traits or a high score with those traits. But remember that each personality trait is a spectrum, right? So you're going to fall somewhere on that spectrum, and that kind of defines your personality. It's important because it's really a good predictor of outcomes such as education and health based on personality traits. And another thing to note is that it does remain relatively stable throughout somebody's lifetime. It can change, obviously, but people's personality tends to stay very similar throughout time. Another thing to note that will affect learning is cognitive bias. Humans are full of biases, right? That's why it's really impossible for us to be objective. And so we're full of this idea of, too much information, right? It kind of goes back to that idea of neural chunking. And so we notice things that are already primed in our memory, right? So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll go through a few. But the key thing here with the bias is having to do with too much information. And then we notice flaws in others more easily than we notice flaws in ourselves. All right, so all of these things that are just kind of programmed into our brain, and these cognitive biases that we have. Another aspect is not enough meaning. So we tend to find stories and patterns even when looking at sparse data, which is a huge problem in science, because a lot of times when we're doing experiments, we would love to see some correlation or causation, right? And so we're going to find the pattern even if it doesn't exist. And sometimes people will go even as far as manipulating their data to just get a pattern. So that's a problem. We fill in characteristics, remember, stereotypes and things like that. And a lot of times we think we know what other people are thinking. We're not actually listening. We're just basically confirming what, as we listen to somebody, a lot of times we're just confirming of what we thought they knew. So like we need to start actually listening more and not think that we know what other people are thinking. All right. Treat them like individuals with unique, ideas. The other thing is you need to act fast. It's a huge cognitive bias as well. So in order to avoid mistakes, we basically aim to preserve our group status and avoid irreversible decisions. In order to get things done, we tend to complete things that we've invested time and energy in. So for example, if you've been working on a project for a very long time and you're very invested in it, even if it's going in the wrong direction, you just want to keep doing it. You want to complete it because you've put so much time and energy into it, and it would be horrible if you stopped, because then that's all a waste, right? So these are things that we need to be considering. Another one is, what should we remember? So we discard specifics to form generalities. Remember the chunking, the neural chunking. It's very important. So a lot of specific information is discarded and we're just forming generalities. It also goes back to the idea of group identity and saying, oh, well, that person's white, or that person's a woman, or that person is, a manager, whatever. It's very important that we do not discard specifics because it can lead to a whole host of problems. We reduce events, and lists to their key elements. We edit and reinforce some memories after the fact. And so remember also that we store memories differently based on how they were experienced. And that kind of goes back to the amygdala too. So fear experiences. So that kind of reinforces a lot of memories with emotion. All right. So this is happening. It's called the cognitive bias codex. There's a ton of them, right? And so you can look into these, but it's this idea that our brain, like psychology, we have these biases that we just are a lot of times out of our control, even if we're aware of them. It's just naturally how our brain is wired. All right. Then we also have learning disorders. Obviously, learning disorders is going to affect learning, right? So we have dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia for arithmetic. Basically, we have problems with our neurological wiring, right? So there clearly can be issues with your brain and learning disorders that can be identified. Now, for example, there's ADHD, so potentially having attention and focus issues. We have dyslexia, reading and sight to memory disconnect, right? Difficulty matching sounds to symbols. We have a problem potentially with estimating time, which could be associated with the cerebellum. And then we also have potentially math and computation issues, and that could be associated with the parietal lobe. Now, let's get into some teaching. So now we covered learning, factors affecting learning, and then teaching. So really, we could go back to this idea of conditioning, which is one of the earliest forms of so-called teaching. So it's this process of training or accustoming a person or animal to behave in a certain way or to accept certain circumstances. There's classical conditioning and there's operant conditioning, and they are processes that lead to learning. So classical conditioning is this idea of Pavlov's dogs. Basically what they would do is when the dog would get food, they would blow this whistle, and then they would start to associate the food with the whistle to the point where the whistle would actually cause the dog to salivate even if there was no food. Okay, similar idea with operant conditioning. You associate a voluntary behavior and a consequence. Okay, so this mouse, for example, starts to associate the pushing of this with the release of a treat or food. Right? Now, it also leads into this idea of the more modern model of conceptual change. So what are we trying to do as teachers? We're trying to take students' prior knowledge, their existing, their alternative knowledge and conceptions, and we're trying to have some sort of a conceptual change into this new changed scientific knowledge and conceptions. And so we also have this idea of equilibration with Piaget, where we're constantly eliminating incompatibilities in our knowledge, all right? But we have certain conditions for conceptual change in order for us to go about this, right? So we want to make sure that it's intelligible, so it's internally consistent and understood, it's plausible, so it's believed to be true, and it's fruitful, so it's provided, explanatory or predictive power. So that would really be a good environment for conceptual change to take place if those conditions are met. Now we have strategies, teaching strategies to tap into this prior knowledge. So integration is one of the most common ones that teachers use. I know you've all experienced it. Basically, it's the idea of integrating new concepts by assuming that students' existing conceptions are from prior lessons. So whatever you learned last time, you know that now, and now we're going to build on that. And obviously that becomes a problem if you miss a day, right? Or whatnot, or if you didn't understand that lesson, you're just going to fall more and more behind. But that is a strategy that's used all the time. Basically, we're going to assume that your prior knowledge is what I taught you last time, right? Now, differentiation is another idea. So differentiating existing conceptions into more clearly defined but closely related new conception. We have exchange. So exchanging one conception with a new one because both of them can't be plausible. And we also have conceptual bridging, which is linking abstract concepts to meaningful common experiences. All right, so that's the conceptual change model. We also have this idea of retention and comprehension. So comprehension, remember, is the action or capability of understanding something. And then retention is the continued possession, use, or control of something. And so we want to comprehend and retain information. I want you to think back to your high school experience, and I want you to think about, some of the things that you remember. Like, what are your most memorable experiences? So think about that. Now, I can almost guarantee, it might not be right, but I can almost guarantee, so what comes to mind when you think about your high school education, that it had something to do with these bottom tiers here. It probably had something to do with a demonstration, a discussion, somewhere where you were practicing doing something, somewhere where you were teaching or presenting something to somebody else. It probably wasn't a lecture or reading a textbook or audiovisual. So we get into this idea of passive versus active learning. And so if you're active in the experience, that's really where learning is best taken place. And so unfortunately, this presentation is more passive, right? So unfortunately, I'm not really practicing what I'm preaching here, but that's not really the goal. My goal is to bring attention to a lot of these concepts, not necessarily to have you learn one particular concept in detail. And so that's really where that active learning is going to come into play. Now, as teachers, we need to have learning goals, right? We want to have a goal for what we want our students to be able to do and know, right? And so our goals need to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. You should be familiar with this as in EPICS, right? And so learning objectives are very similar. And so we basically can use the idea of Bloom's taxonomy. It's a very important tool that can be used when we're writing these learning objectives. So we have a goal for what we want to teach students, and there's different levels associated with that, and there's different words that we can use to describe what we would put in those learning objectives. So this is really a nice way to do lesson planning, is kind of take some of these words. So I want students to be able to assemble, or to be able to argue, or to be able to classify, or whatever, right? And so it's this idea that creating is kind of the highest level, whereas remembering or just factually recalling something is the lowest level. And that really helps teachers kind of with their objectives. The other thing is this idea of a learning cycle or inquiry cycle. We have this idea of, this 5E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, actually, we have this idea of a 7E. There's 5E and 7E, but this is 7E. So we want to engage students, elicit, explore, explain, elaborate, extend, and then we have evaluate with assessment. And basically, the general idea of a teacher can be summed up with these three parts, PI. You need a plan. So what do I want the learners to know? You need to implement the plan. So what will the learners do to learn this? And then you need to evaluate the plan. So how will I know the effectiveness of what I just did and improve for the next time? So that's a lot of what goes into teaching. It's a lot of times very cyclical. The other thing to consider is the EPICS design process here. Engineering is constantly being put into the classroom because the engineering design process is a great place for learning to take place. The engineering design process is, a fertile grounds for learning. Now we also have this idea of integrated STEM. So we have this engineering design, we have mathematical thinking, technology, and science, kind of all part of this pulley, which is pulling up this situated STEM learning. And it involves this community of practice. And so that's a fairly popular model of education now, is this idea of integrating STEM, integrating all these subjects together. And a lot of times the way you do that is through the engineering design process. And we want to be able to promote conceptual change. So promoting conceptual change, we're basically, it's this idea that as teachers, we want these conceptual changes to happen, right? And it basically involves learning as an act of construction. So we need to construct these new ideas, and it involves helping students generate appropriate meanings and be able to link these meanings to other ideas in their memory, and basically be able to evaluate newly constructed ideas and the way that the old ideas are related in their memory. All right, so it's basically all about these generation of links, linking the old with the new. That's what teaching is all about. That's what learning is all about. All right, linking your current self to what you will be, right? So you're learning something new. And also the promotion of metacognition. So as a human, you have the ability to control your own learning and thinking. And so when you're thinking about thinking, it's basically metacognition. And so promoting that by having students reflect on their own learning, for example, is really important. Now, it also goes back to the idea of pedagogical content knowledge. So teachers need to know things in order to teach, right? But they also need to know not only the things, but how to teach those things. And so that's where pedagogy comes in. Pedagogy is the method or practice of teaching, and you have content that you're teaching, right? And so often we refer to pedagogical content knowledge, where we basically have this pedagogical knowledge, this contextual knowledge, and the subject matter knowledge kind of coming together for the knowledge needed for classroom teaching to take place, right? And so we have an integrative model and a transformative model. But the idea is that, teachers definitely need a diverse range of knowledge in order for teaching to take place, right? It's all about getting to this pedagogical content knowledge, either through integrative or transformative ways. So the implications for this, right? Students encounter difficulties anytime that their cognition is outpaced by instruction, or if it outpaces instruction. Remember, we want to stay in that zone of proximal development. And so these effective teaching strategies really need to incorporate the idea of brain-based learning and what we know about the brain. So the idea of breaking things into small chunks, so neural chunking, the idea of quality over quantity in certain regards. If your goal is to get somebody to learn something, in this case, quality is actually not as important as quantity. The goal is to give you a broad overview. But coincidentally, this approach is the best for all students. So we're trying to find a way, not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, but we're trying to piece together what does effective learning look like? What does effective teaching look like? How can we devise strategies where we're tapping into people's brains, based on their biology, based on what it means for them to be human, so we can have strategies that will work for everybody. And so it leads to this idea of this universal design for learning, right? We want to be able to have the what of learning, the how of learning, and the why of learning, which are different areas of your brain, all kind of tapped. We want to tap into those areas. And so what is brain-based learning all about? It's basically this idea that the hidden curriculum is significant. You know, what goes on behind the scenes, the emotions, you know, the things that happen outside of the standards are important to note, right? For example, a bright space for learning. So if things are bright, if your room is bright versus dark, it's going to encourage you more to pay attention, because when things are dark, it kind of signals your brain to secrete melatonin, which will make you tired and try to go to sleep. Physical activity, we want massive amounts of oxygen getting to your brain. We want good sleep. We want good diet. We want a good environment. We want, you know, coping skills, relationship building. We want to reorient the understanding of the brain to this idea of neuroplasticity and grit with that growth mindset. We want to make sure we stay in the zone of proximal development. We're going to build on that prior knowledge. We're going to potentially use storytelling to connect prior concepts. We can use the idea of color or change. Notice how I have bold and red words on this presentation. I'm drawing your attention. How can we leverage people's attention? Also, distraction is a really important idea too, especially for kids. I used to work at the Michael Phelps Swim School, and teaching kids how to swim who were terrified of the water is a very difficult thing to do. And one thing that you can do with a kid who is getting very emotional is distract them. And it's not mean, it's just taking their brain to a different state, and it's getting them to calm down. So purposeful distraction, controlling attention, using color and change is important. Dividing material into chunks is huge. Storytelling and analogies, again, is important. We have this idea of concept mapping and cross-linking. So we want to bridge the disciplines together with integrated STEM. And we want people to think holistically about things. We don't want people to think in silos like math, technology, engineering. Oh, that's biology, that's not chemistry. No, that's not true, right? There's biochemistry, which links the whole field of chemistry to biology, right? So it's very important to view holistically these things. The other thing is to be succinct in your communication. So try to limit unnecessary data, repeat things, so repetition to strengthen those connections. A sense of urgency is important. It's urgent that you learn this, right? It's very urgent. So people will start to engage more if they have a sense of urgency, right? For example, my bathroom just leaked. I woke up this morning and I went into my bathroom and there was water on the floor, and I was like, uh-oh, right? So I cleaned it all up and I found the leak. I never had figured out, I have never changed the supply valve before, but you can be sure that there was a sense of urgency, and I needed to learn how to do that very quickly. So I quickly learned how to do that, and I did that today. I replaced my supply valve for my bathroom sink. Now we also, it's important to understand that we want to think fast but talk slow. So we want to use wait time. So anytime you ask a question, you want to give people the chance to comprehend that question, come up with answers. So the idea of wait time is important. If I asked you a question and then I gave you 0 time to answer it, or 1 second later, I'm like, oh, okay, nobody has any questions. It's not really effective at all. We want to wait at least 3 seconds, more like 7 seconds. We want to be dynamic and eclectic. So we want to avoid being monotone. We want to give timely feedback, and we want to gamify learning if we can. We want to leverage technology, and we want to develop this community of practice. So we want to leverage the social aspects of learning. So those are all things that have kind of been proven to work, right? So we want to keep some of these things in mind. It's not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the things, some of the little tips that I wanted to share with you guys. All right, so we got one last little video. It's like 2 minutes long, and then we'll wrap it up.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
All right, so that leads us into the conclusion. So we have a summary and a discussion. And so the summary here is we have billions of power-hungry neurons to maintain as we speak, all right? And the idea is that this brain-based learning and neuroplasticity is an important aspect of our lives that we should understand. Our brain changes with experiences. We can see that there's more neural activity here after learning in this area. We know that if we're viewing people based on the human race, then it's really hard to discriminate, right? Remember, we talked about the idea of group versus individual identity. And so discriminating on the basis of one of those groups, like race, class, gender, religion, etc., it's hard to do if you understand things from a brain-based perspective. Learning is a generative and revisionary process. So remember the equilibration that is constantly being done to eliminate incompatibilities in our conceptions. We have a unique lens with prior knowledge when learning. So everybody has a unique way in which they view the world based on their own experiences in biology. And we need to tap into that prior knowledge in order to learn effectively. Behavior and beliefs are controlled by your brain, right? And there's always a reason for behavior and beliefs, and it stems from nature and nurture. And so getting to the root of that behavior or the root of that belief is important. Learning is a process from moving to one state to another, right? Your brain is different after learning. So you're moving from a state of not knowing to knowing. And learning requires energy, but it can be pleasurable, remember, if you're in the zone of proximal development. And so we want to stimulate those reward pathways in our brain by making learning pleasurable. And so educators and learners need to make sure that they apply this knowledge about how the brain learns and into the ways that they think and the way that they communicate. And lastly, educators, one of the reasons I do what I do is because educators literally change people's brains and exponentially increase their sphere of influence because of it, right? So if we can change other people's brains, then those people's brains can change other people's brains and so on, right? So we have this idea of a sphere of influence, and we can increase that by educating others, right? And so your brains are literally different after this presentation than it was at the beginning. Okay, so just really quickly, I would like to go over just these two questions. So what information was meaningful or surprising to you in this presentation? And then how can you apply this information in your life and work at Epix? All right, so I'll give you a second to think about those two questions. Actually, more than a second, because remember the wait time. And so we'll give you at least 7 seconds. So there was a lot of information. So what information stood out to you and how can you apply it? So let's have Isabella share.
Yeah, so I really liked what you said about learning pleasure and how, things that are too boring or like too easy aren't exciting, like we don't want to learn it, or things that are too hard, like, oh, that's too difficult, like I don't want to put my time into that. And that's definitely visible with a lot of classes. And I think in terms of like applying that to Epix, just making sure that the project that you're working on not only like meets the project partner standards, but also gives your group a challenge that is in like fun in ways, but also, yeah, just like making sure that people are challenged, but also able to complete the project.
Sure, yeah, and I would urge you to do some more research on the zone of proximal development. It's this idea developed by Lev Vygotsky, and he's a very big proponent of social constructivism. And so that is definitely a very important aspect of learning, but there's evidence in the neuroscience to support that as well with the reward systems of our brain. So thanks for pointing that out. Can we have somebody else share what information stood out to you, was meaningful? Let's go with Chelsea.
Sorry, I had to remember how to unmute myself. So I think the most meaningful thing to me was from the first video you showed, the active thinking, because I did that already and I didn't know it was like an actual like neuroscience thing. And then the application for epics, I think like the reward pathways, like when we do something like well, or we do something like efficiently in epics, like making sure like we reward ourselves to like make that like a really big part of our brain.
Sure. And when you say the first video, are you're referring to the one where we talked about the 3 layers of the brain?
Yes.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way, especially from an evolutionary perspective of thinking about the brain and how level 1 can talk to level 3 and 3 talk to 1 and the different levels can talk to each other. Awesome. Can we have Gabriella share?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? I've been having some mic issues, just want to make sure.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think the one thing that I thought was really interesting was when you're talking about like the electric shock experiment, you know, because I guess it's not something I never really considered, like people would essentially like induce like an unpleasant experience so that they're not bored, but it does make sense in some situations. I mean, like I guess I can think of certain scenarios where I would see that might happen. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I also thought what you're talking about too with like the zone of proximal development was really interesting too. And I think Isabella kind of said what I was going to say, just making sure that we're challenging our ethics teams, but not going into a realm that people feel that we're trying to get an unattainable goal. So just making sure we're, you know, under the middle section of kind of that bell curve. And then just the part where you talked about people kind of being like formed and defined by the groups that they're part of. I thought that was really interesting too.
Yeah, I like the idea of the group identity, and don't forget about the categorical thinking and the neural chunking. It's a really important aspect of learning and the reason why we like to simplify information and those cognitive biases that we talked about. Yeah, really important. So thank you for sharing. I spent a lot of time on this presentation trying to expose you to some of the areas of learning and teaching and things that affect teaching. So hopefully you can take some of the stuff that you were exposed to tonight and take it upon yourself to research it more, because there's a lot to learn about these things. And my goal, remember, was to give you a broad overview. And so we've come to the end now, and remember that we have informal learning coming up and human development coming up as well. If you'd like to join me for that, have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks.